Section 18 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, September, Part 2. That summer is drawing to its end, and autumn close at hand, one need not look at the calendar to know. Throughout a morning's walk, signs of imminent change crop up now at every turn. The wild arums that you have forgotten since last you saw them turning their pale green cowls from the light, give out a bold glitter of scarlet in the shady deeps under every hedgerow. Each day sees the hips and haws growing ruddier. Though September is scarce half gone, the green bracken fronds in the woods are already alight at the tips with crimson and gold, and the heather on the combe side has lost its clear rose red. The song of the bees in it seems as loud as ever, but for every tuft of living blossom there are two that are faded and brown. The good times are nearly over for the honey makers, and each day the gathering of a full load of nectar means travelling farther afield. I wonder why it is I always look forward to the renewal of the year's life with so much eagerness and impatience, and yet meet its decline with such surpassing equanimity. Am I have often asked myself lately, the same being who industriously searched the river bank for a whole bleak February morning in quest of the first coltsfoot, greeting it with an unconscionable extravagance of rejoicing? I who now tread the same way, in nowise perturbed, nor even unelated, at the obvious fact of each day's lessened ardour. The truth that the year is already on the long downward road, riding for its winter fall, awakens in me not a pang of regret. Indeed, I neither remember the departed magnificence of June as something lost, nor regard the ever diminishing September days as portent of penurious times to come. With autumn, as with advancing age, when once each is assured, irrevocable, the natural tendency seems to be towards a looking neither backward nor forward, but towards a joyful acceptance of the things that are. And so, at these times, whatever our declared principles, we one and all develop, or degenerate, into optimists. But, of a truth, it needs very little of this mental condiment to be happy in a Sussex Downland village in September. Perhaps none but the very old can, at any time, sincerely avow a repugnance towards machinery in farming. Certainly, at this season of the year, the whole spirit of village life receives benefit from it. They have been threshing up at the farm to day, and from sunrise to sunset, all through the still, quiet, golden hours, the voice of the threshing mill has permeated everything, blent itself with the song of the robins in the garden, with the chime from the smithy, with all the other sounds of labour that go to make up the silence of country dwelling places. I have come to look upon this sound as the veritable keynote of autumn, and to believe that it has an influence on all hearts at this season, entirely underrated by those whose business it is to study rural affairs. It is the fashion to contemn the old melodramatic trick of still music. But, for my own part, I have never been able to resist the low sobbing and sighing of the violins when the stage story is being cleared up, all wrongs righted, and the villain given his due. The speech itself is nothing to me. It is seldom regarded, and remembered never. I should be just as deeply moved if all that leashed, melodious passion went as setting to Old Mother Hubbard, or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And on the same principle, when this beautiful solemn voice of the threshing mill dwells in the autumnal air, I find myself doing the commonest things with a sense of high fate and speeding of the world's progress. But, indeed, nature works throughout largely on this still music plan, and therein lies one inestimable advantage of living in the country. Birdsong, to all intents and purposes, unceasing throughout the year, the songs of stream, river and sea, the songs of the four winds, all work together for good on the hearts of those men and women who, by their own design or by external destiny, have been led to keep their thread of life running by green woods and fields. As the sun went down behind the hills and left the world afloat in wine-coloured mist, every sound of work ceased in the village, save this rich throbbing voice of the threshing mill up at the farm. I went out into the dreaming light to listen to it. From where I sat on the churchyard wall, I could make out that they were prolonging the work into the dusk, so that the last rick might be finished now, and the threshing gang move on tonight to the next farm. There was the deep sound of the mill itself, one tremendous baritone note succeeding another, each held for a moment, and then suddenly changing to one higher or lower in the sonorous clef. Apart from this, I could distinguish the fuss and fume of the engine as it drove its white breath in little unsteady gusts up against the violet calm of the sky. And there was another sound, the flapping song of the driving belt, a note that punctuated everything, as though some invisible conductor were beating time to the general symphony. But the combined effect of all was infinitely harmonious and restful. Yet I had come out, in the main, to hear, not this familiar part of the music, but something about it that I loved to hear most of all, and this was the stopping of the machine. It was almost dark before the last sheaf went to the mill and steam was shut off. And then the wonderful note began. The machine took an appreciable time to run down, but now there was no upward inflection in its voice. Note by note, each note more drawn out and quieter, the rich tones fell through every stage of an octave, until at last they died away in the profoundest, softest bass. Even then I fancied I could feel the solid earth still shuddering with a music too deep for human ear. I think the last of the summer boating parties to Windlecombe has come and gone. At least for a week I have seen and heard nothing of revelry, but the thin stream of odd folk still dribbles into the village from road or down. There were two elderly ladies, obviously sisters, wandering about the place one day, who afforded material for commentary to most curious tongues. Severely and sparely clad in grey tweeds, wearing black felt hats, each wrapped about with a wisp of grey gauze, and gold spectacles, over the shining halves of which little tight glossy white ringlets depended, pink serene faces inclined to be downy, and voices low and gentle yet extraordinarily penetrating and clear. They crept about the village all day long in an ecstasy of enjoyment, peering into cottage doorways, looking over garden fences, watching the children at play on the green and the mothers hanging out their linen, gazing with timorous delight down into the wheelwright sawpit, and into the black deeps of Tom Clemmer's forge. And all the while, though they kept up an incessant low interchange between themselves, they accosted no one. Apparently Windlecombe was to them a sort of spectacle, half peep show and half menagerie, where everything might be looked at, but nothing touched. The last I saw of them, they were standing at the far end of the green, looking towards the seats under the Seven Sisters, where two old rustics slumbered peacefully in the sun. The pair were in earnest consultation, and obvious, though wholly affectionate difference on some point. At length, one, apparently the more ancient by a year or two, raised her hands with a gesture of reluctant consent, and then the other timidly approached the old men, presented each with what, at a distance, appeared to be a surplus sandwich drawn from a reticule, and returned to her companion, giving her, before they made off down the street together, a grateful, childish little hug. On another day, a very different pair dropped down from the skies amongst us. They were two men, scarcely of middle age, the one with a swirl of coppery hair topping a high forehead, the other sombre-locked, low-browed and swarthy. Both alike shabby, unshaven and unkempt. They came swinging down the hill path together, hatless and barefooted, laden up with certain dusty travelling gear, the one of them carrying in addition a leather-cased violin. As they strode through the village street, they made the place resound with their laughter, jovially greeted all and sundry that chanced in their way, and finally disappeared through the door of the Three Thatchers Inn. Thereafter, sitting at work by the window, I forgot all about them, until a far-off strain of music gradually forced itself upon my ear. I could make out the violin, played as though it were three instruments at least, and above it such a voice as I had heard only once in my life before. I saw that passers-by were halting in the roadway to listen. Some were crowded round the inn window, craning over one another's heads. Then the music stopped, the pair of harmonious vagabonds reappeared, and made straight for the Seven Sisters, all the folk jostling at their heels. A moment later the violin struck into an air that sent my pen clattering to the paper, and my feet speeding towards the house door. It was the X something, the tenor song from Q something, played by a master hand. Before I reached the fringe of the little crowd, taking the old vicar by the arm as I went, the copper-haired man had mounted upon the seat and had begun to sing the incomparable melody, hurling it over the heads of the crowd with a passion, a force, yet with a surpassingly delicate sweetness of tone, that drew the people spellbound, closer and closer with every moment round him. The old parson's grip tightened on my sleeve. "What is he like?" he whispered, and when I had told him, "Strange that he should come here, and but there can be few with a voice like that. It must be Ah, listen! don't you know now?" For the song had changed. The violin had slowed down into a simple, quiet undertone, and then there pealed out upon us an air that a year ago had been made famous by one man alone, and he almost the greatest in his art. As he sang, his great chest heaving in the sunshine, I watched him, and once he looked swiftly in our direction. He gave us the whole piece, that finishes on a note incredibly high, yet is not really an end to the song, for the note is one picked out, as it were, at random in the scale. Then, to my amazement, he got down from the bench, took the hat from the head of the nearest boy, and went gravely about among the folk, collecting pennies. From me he levied toll as from the rest, but instead of holding out the hat to the reverend, he placed it, money and all, into his hands, adding to the goodly store a shining piece from his own pocket. "You will know what to do with it," said he, his grey eyes twinkling merrily. A minute later the pair were trudging off together down the street as they had come, with their dusty travel-stained satchels swinging behind them, and their long hair blowing in the breeze. Yes, the summer is gone, in very truth. With every day now, and every hour of the day, the writing on the wall shows plainer. While the hushed, hot times endured, it was still possible to believe red autumn as far away as ever, for not a leaf in oak or elm has changed, nor will change, perhaps, for weeks to come. But the telltale winds of the equinox are upon us, bringing the very voice of autumn with them, and the acorns are falling by the river, and the thistledown drifting white upon the hills. I began this day badly, that is to say, from my own private point of view, which is a point, it may well be, like Euclid's, having position but no dimensions, yet a point nevertheless. Chancing to wake with the dawn, I saw that the day was beginning with a beautiful smoke-pearl trellis in the east, behind which welled up an ever-strengthening fountain of silver white. Coming presently out upon the green under this pure, pale glow of morning, I was startled by a cry that came echoing from the misty twilight of the hills. "Hie up! Hie up! Voila! Voila! Voila!" Hoarse, harsh, undeniably brutal it sounded in the sweet snow-white lustre of the virgin light. And then came the shrill blare of the huntsman's horn, the confused yelping and baying of the pack, and the dull thunder of beating hoofs as the hunt drove over the hilltop and fell to drawing windle coverts. At once the silent village awoke. Windows were thrown open and heads appeared. Dark figures burst from cottage doors and went pounding up the lane that led to the hills. Round the covert the horsemen gathered in a motionless ring, while the huntsman drove his pack through the undergrowth, for ever urging them forward with that fierce guttural note, which was more like the cry of a wolf than a man. At length a fine cub fox broke cover, and led the whole company a ding-dong chase over the hills and out of sight and hearing for good. Some hours later I met Farmer Coles and his two sons returning from the sport, and the youngest, a mere schoolboy, mounted on a pony, his head as he rode reaching scarce to his father's saddle peak. He was in huge high spirits, displaying the brush, his share of the spoil, to all acquaintance as he passed. And the face of this yellow-haired, chubby child was bedaubed with blood, thick zebra-like streaks of it smudged across his smooth forehead and rosy baby cheeks. He was going home delighted, to show to an admiring mother how he had been blooded at his first cub hunt. And in all that countryside, I thought to myself as I passed on, there was scarce a man or woman of station and breeding who would not have applauded son of theirs returning home in such a plight. Nor, though at the time the thing filled me personally with genuine horror and loathing, did I condemn it, nor wish to see its like made impossible in the land. For the sybaritish, lotus-eating danger is too imminent in our midst for any such Fabian trifling. It will be a woeful day for England when we have bred out of our young manhood the last instincts of the healthy brute. I got into Runridge's skiff, in the absence of its owner, and pushed off into mid-stream, letting the little craft drift whither it would. Wind and tide together were setting strongly up country. Swiftly the reedy banks glided by as we bore through the meadows that lie at the foot of the hills. The summer was gone, indeed, and gone with it that sense of striving towards achievement. The year seemed to be resting upon its oars, as I was doing. All its fruit was set. There remained nothing now but to wait and let it ripen. It was just this waiting and resting that made up autumn's greatest charm. I set my elbows on my knees and my chin on my hands, and let the little boat choose a destiny for the idle pair of us. The bank was high to windward. We drifted in an almost unruffled calm, while overhead there sailed by an unending cloud of thistledown, tiny verticils of sunlit silver, each gleaming star-like against the morning blue. Most of them took the broad river at a stride, disappearing over the opposite bank, but many fell upon the water. Thousands of them floated around me, and as far as eye could reach, the water was grey and misty with them, and this was only one nook of earth in innumerable miles. How was it, I asked of the wind above me, that with such inexhaustible store of thistle seed she could not sow the whole land thick with thistles in a single season, and drive all other things from the fields? The answer was to be obtained for the mere raising of a hand. For it is not the thistle seed that flies, but only the harmless thistledown. Moreover, among the millions of airships that each thistle patch sends off upon the wind throughout a breezy autumn day, not 1 in 50 ever bore a seed, or, if bearing it, contrived to carry its burden more than a yard or two. The curved seed pod of the thistle is attached to its feathery volute only by the slenderest thread, and is brushed off by the lightest touch of the first grass blade as it sails low over the sward. But the thistledown, lightened of its counterpoise, bowls on for ever. End of section 18. Section 19 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, October, Part 1. With each October, in every year for a long time past, I have watched for the going of the martins, but have never yet contrived to witness the moment of their flight. It has always happened in the same way. One day they have been as busy as ever about the roof eaves, their chattering song pervading the house unceasingly from dark to dark. And then a morning comes, generally towards the end of the first week in the month, when I awaken to a curious sense of strangeness and loss. First I mark the unwonted silence outside the windows, and then I guess what has come about. Looking forth, I see that the little mud houses, huddled together in a long row under the eaves, are deserted and silent at last. But to-day, though I missed the departure of the martins as usual, I was not wholly disappointed. Getting up in the new silence and throwing the windows back, I looked along the roof edge. Save for the chippering and fluttering of a few sparrows, there was nothing to be seen or heard in the dim grey light. But it seemed the little army could have been away only a few minutes before me, for while I looked I saw the last of them depart. One single note of the remembered song broke out overhead. There was a whir of wings, and the little black and white bird lanced straight off, going due south unhesitatingly, as though the vanished throng of her companions was yet visible far away in the skies. It was a still, grey, warm morning. There had been no dew. Everything, as presently I went along by the woodside, was quite dry, and though it was barely 8 o'clock, all the spiders in the bushes were hard at work weaving their snares. It was almost perfect spinning weather. On windy mornings, though the webs must be made, the task is difficult and the work seldom properly carried out. But to-day there was only a vague air moving from the south-west, and all the spiders had got to work betimes, and with light hearts. The great charm in all nature study is to find out the truth for yourself at first hand. There are few things in my life I regret so keenly as the reading of nature books. This has robbed me of many a moment of pleasurable surprise. For to recognise a commonly accepted fact is poor substitute for its original discovery, although this discovery may have been made by others 1,000 times before. Looking back over 20 years poking and prying in the woods and fields around Windlecombe, I rejoice not so much at the many things I have found out, but at the fact of so many things still unread of and still remaining to be discovered. This morning, as I went along by the bushes in the lee of the wood and saw the spiders at work, it suddenly occurred to me that I knew little or nothing about them, and the recognition of this ignorance came to me as truest bliss. I fell to looking on at the ingenious, complicated work with almost as much anxiety and interest as the male spiders themselves. For it appears to be only the female who spins a web. The big-bodied spider, so industriously occupied in every gap of the thicket, is always the female, though the male is never far off. You are sure to find him peering out from under one of the adjacent leaves, or treading timidly on the circumference of the web, trying to attract the attention, and thereafter, perhaps, the regard of its maker. Spider nets and their weavers have, I think, never been given quite their place in the world of wonders. As far as human profit is concerned, spiders are useless things, and have therefore missed, because, from that standpoint, they have not merited, popular favour. But no doubt their ingenuity as craftswomen stands very nearly on a level with that of the worker honey bee. The waxen comb of the bee, whose perfection is due to the combined arts of engineer, mason, and geometrician, is very little superior in design and carrying out to the spider's web. On these still, grey autumn mornings, the tendency of the eye is not to wander far afield, but to concern itself with the little things of the wayside close at hand. And so, more than at any other time of the year, perhaps, the spiders and their ways come in for narrow scrutiny. And here is something, in the first loving investigation, of which the uninformed, unread observer is much to be envied. He notices in the outset that these fine silken snares, hung by the spiders in the hedgerows, are of two kinds. The one placed vertically across a gap in the surface of the thicket, the other placed horizontally, closing up some shaft or upward passageway in the heart of the green bush. The vertical net is seen to be composed of a number of threads radiating from a common centre, and upon these threads an ever increasing spiral line has been laid, forming a regular meshed net. But the horizontal web has none of this geometric neatness. It is a mere expanse of fine tissue irregularly woven into a sort of crazy pattern, and slung, hammock fashion, completely closing the chimney-like hollow wherein it has been made. From a view of the finished webs, two other facts will be noted. The vertical net is supported only by lines springing from its circumference, and the spider sits at its centre in front. The horizontal net is suspended by numberless fine lines, attached at all points in its upper surface, while the spider clings to the underside as she lies in wait for her prey. But it is in the actual weaving of the nets that the interest of the onlooker will be chiefly centred. The maker of the vertical, or cartwheel, pattern of web begins operations in various ways, according to the conditions imposed upon her by the weather and the spot she has selected. Webs made in calm seasons, or when only light airs are stirring, will have few mainstays, and these may be of considerable length. But in windy times the spider will stretch her snare on only short hawsers, using as many as may be necessary to make assurance doubly sure. But in either case she will commence the work in much the same way. First she goes to the highest point on the windward side of her gap, and turning her head to the current, begins to pay out a line behind her. As she floats this out, she continually tries it with her leg until she knows that the end of the line has caught in the opposite twigs. Then she runs to the middle of this horizontal line, dragging after her another thread which she has previously attached to her original starting point. From the centre of the first line she lowers herself vertically, always dragging the second line in her rear until she reaches a twig below. Here she draws her second line tight and fastens it, after which she climbs to the horizontal line and repeats the manoeuvre, only this time from its leeward end. Thus, the triangle of mainstays, the first essential in all spider web making, is complete. The weaving of the net within this triangular frame is the next work undertaken. The spider, when she first dropped from the centre of her uppermost thread, made a vertical line in descending. Some point on this line marks the centre of the future cartwheel pattern of web, and this central point the spider now finds unerringly, and begins to put in one by one the radiating spokes of the wheel. When all these spokes are in place, she returns to the centre, and revolving her body quickly, she forms upon it a close spiral of 4 or 5 turns. This is to be her seat and watchtower, whence she will keep the whole web under observation. Having done this, she now, if the morning is at all breezy, carries temporary stray lines from spoke to spoke all round the web, these isolated circles of thread occurring at intervals of an inch or so between centre and circumference. But on still mornings this part of her work is omitted as unnecessary, and she proceeds at once to the main spinning of the net. The construction of the cross threads between the spokes of the web is always commenced at the extreme outer edges of the space to be filled, and the spider works inwardly, carrying the thread round and round from spoke to spoke until she arrives within half an inch or so of the central small spiral. But the two are never joined. An interval is always left where the web consists of nothing but bare radiating lines. The snare is now finished. The spider takes up her station in the middle of the net, with no more to do for the rest of the day but take what fair chance and her own crafty ingenuity may provide. Yet, having thus watched the making of a spider web from start to finish, and having noted all the details of construction here set down, there is something more about the matter which, if it escape the observer, will leave him in the rather disgraceful plight of having missed the most wonderful thing of all. The spider's snare is not woven throughout of the same kind of thread. 2 kinds are used, and the difference between them is apparent even to eyes of very moderate power. While the triangle and the radiating lines are made of plain silk, the cross threads are corrugated, and look like strings of tiny transparent beads. A touch of the finger will prove that these beads are really adhering drops of some glutinous fluid, whose use is not difficult to guess. But how do the beads get onto the line, seeing that this, when first drawn from the spider's body, is visibly nothing but a plain filament of silk, like the rest of the web? The question has been asked many times, and the answer commonly given is, I have come to believe, an entirely erroneous one. We are told that the thread used for the crossbars in a spider's web, when it first emerges from the creature's body, is only smeared, not beaded with the gluten, but that after attaching each segment of the spiral to the spokes, the spider gives it a twang with her foot, thus causing the gluten to separate into beads. Here then is a fact such as one would read in the nature books and unquestionably accept. But a little independent experiment with various kinds of strings, elastic or non-elastic, and smeared with different glutinous substances, reveals the fact that no amount of twanging will induce the latter to divide into beads, such as one sees in the spider line. In every case, the tendency of the gluten in the experiment is to fly off altogether, or to gather to one side of the string. But to any that desires to know the truth of the thing, the spider herself will speedily resolve the difficulty. Watch her at work, and it will soon be seen that the beads are formed on the line, not by twanging, but by stretching. At the moment each length of sticky thread is drawn from the spider's spinnerets, it is destitute of beads. But the spider quickly stretches it out to nearly double its original length, and then as quickly slackens it. Whereupon, before she has well had time to fasten the thread in its place, the beads will be seen to have formed themselves throughout its entire length. Said Miss Susan Angel this evening, as I leant over the counter of her little dark shop, studying the rows of sweetstuff bottles beyond, "The chillun here, 'tis real astonishin' how changeable they be. One time 'tis all lickrish wi' 'em, and next 'tis all sherbet suckers, and then maybe 'tis nought but toffee balls for weeks on end. But you," she turned me a glance full of smiling, proud approbation, "you, come winter or summer, come rain or shine, I allers knaws 'twill be nobbut black 'fores." She reached down the ancient glass jar and stabbed at its contents ruminatively with an iron fork. "Black 'fores, ah!" she mused, as the shining magpie lumps rattled into the brass scale pan. "And I never smells 'em, but I thinks of my old missus as Lawry me, how many long year ago! Fond on 'em were she? Ah, and scrunch 'em up I could quicker'n e'er one wi' a nat'ral jaw." "What kind of jaw, then, had she, Susan?" "Ah, I believe ye. My dear, the money as it costed. All gold and ivory like, and red stuff. And when it died, did I never show 'em to ye?" She disappeared into the little kitchen behind the shop. I heard a drawer unlocked. There was a sound of rummaging, accompanied by asthmatic interjections. Miss Susan Angel came forth again, bearing a bulky parcel. This, as she removed various coverings, became smaller and smaller, until, from a final wrapping of tissue paper, there appeared a beautiful double set of false teeth. Miss Angel held them up to my gaze admiringly. "Left 'em to me, 'a did. 'Twere all writ in her will. To my faithful servant and friend, Susan Angel, I give and bequeath, and all the rest on it. Ah, bless her and rest her soul." It seemed rather an appropriate legacy, for Miss Angel had possessed not a single tooth of her own in all the years I had known her. But the display of the treasure provoked a very natural commentary. "How long have you had these put by, Susan?" "Nigh upon 30 year, my dear." "And never used them yourself all that time, although you What?" The old lady drew herself up, the youthful blue eyes in her wrinkled face flashing indignation. "What d'ye say? Me use 'em? Me? The very same as my dear old Mrs. Chowd wi'? Shame on ye! Not if there was nought to eat but cracker nuts left in the world for us all." I took the rebuke in penitent silence. When she had restored the revered relics to their locker in the back room, she resumed her knitting in the great wicker chair behind the counter. In a minute or two she had alike forgiven me and forgotten the cause of her displeasure, as I knew from her tone. "How the evenings do draw in, to be sure," she observed, laying down her work. "A'most dark it be, though 'tis no more than 6 o'clock." The ancient timepiece in the corner promptly droned out 11. Miss Angel clapped her hands. "What did I tell ye?" she said triumphantly. "Wonderful good time a keeps when I recollects to put 'en back reg'lar." She rose and reversed the hands for a circle or two. "That'll do till mornin'," said she placidly. "Yer wants to be a little partickler in country places. It bean't like in towns where Gypsies, I do believe, and this time o' night to be sure." I followed her sudden glance to the doorway. A heavy grinding of wheels had sounded outside, and across our field of view, silhouetted against the deep turquoise blue of the night, there passed what looked like a gypsy's caravan. A bony horse toiled in the shafts, and a long lean man walked in front, dragging at the animal's bridle with almost as much apparent effort. Lights shone from the windows of the vehicle, and its chimney smoked voluminously against the stars. As it went by, we could see another man sitting upon the steps in the rear, his squat, bulky form entirely blocking the open door place. The caravan pulled up about midway over the green. "Now, that won't do," observed Miss Angel decisively. "We wants none o' they sort traipsin' about Windlecombe after dark, leastways not as them as keeps chicken. 'Tis on your road home. Jest give 'em a word as you goos by, my dear. Tell 'em as you wants to save trouble for the policeman." End of section 19. Section 20 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, October, Part 2. In no wise intending to disturb the gypsies, I nevertheless took the short cut over the green, passing in the darkness close by their queer, spindle-shanked, top-heavy dwelling. As I cut through the beam of light that poured from the doorway, a suave voice hailed me. "Hi, my man! Just a moment. Now, Grews, your difficulty is at an end. I have intercepted one of the inhabitants, and doubtless he will yes, inquire of him, very politely now, where we may obtain water." The long lean man had blundered into the light beside me, carrying 2 pails. He was clothed in little better than rags from head to foot. A massive gold watch chain glittered across his buttonless waistcoat. He turned upon me 2 gaunt, diffident eyes. "Water," he hesitated, holding out the pails helplessly before him. Water, you know. Could you be so kind as to—" The suave flute-like voice sounded again from the depths of the caravan. "Now, Grews, if I am to carry out the little supper scheme I explained to you, no time must be lost. When once they are peeled, potatoes should never—" The owner of the voice appeared in the doorway. "Dear, my good fellow, there you are, still standing there, and I fully impressed it upon you that if rabbit is permitted to bake one moment longer then— Grews, give me those pails." but the long lean man had drawn me precipitately away. As we hurried across the green together in the direction of the well house, he seemed to consider himself under some necessity of explanation. "It is his caravan," he said. "Spelthorne's, you know. And I am travelling with him for a bit, because I was run down, and other things. One of the best fellows breathing, he is, though you mightn't. I mean, I so often forget what I... Of course, I really don't wonder that sometimes he... Why, I have forgotten to unharness the horse. Do remind me, will you, when we get back? But quietly, you understand. Spelthorne, he is the best fellow breathing, but... Oh, is this the well? It is most kind of you, I'm sure." He seemed in so strained and nervous a mood that I did not trust him to handle the heavy bucket and chain, nor to return unaided to the caravan with his burden. When we drew into the beam of light again, I could see Spelthorne inside, stooping over the little cooking stove in his shirt sleeves and a great sombrero. If anything, his clothes were even more tattered and soiled than his companions. At sound of our clanking pails he turned, stared, then swept me a low bow with the sombrero. Thoughtless, very thoughtless. Indeed, most selfish of grooves, he said confidentially, for the long lean man had hurried away to attend to the horse. A good fellow, such a good fellow you cannot think, but he has this little failing of sometimes taking advantage of any kindness that... But excuse me, I must get the potatoes on." I had hardly gone a dozen paces towards home when I heard him pounding after me. "What is the name?" he asked breathlessly. Of this village?" And when I had told him, "There are beautiful old cottages here, are there not? And quaint people, and charming country round about. Such a spot, isn't it, where two artists could find incessant inspiration, and... But the question had been put to me before, and too often. "Well, I don't know," said I discouragingly. "The place is very quiet and humdrum, and most inconvenient. No railway and no roads to anywhere, and... The very place," he broke in delightedly. "I shall persuade poor Greuze to remain here with me for a month." And when I took a last look at the night some hours after, I beheld the faint glow from the windows of the caravan upon the green with dismal foreboding. A month of that prospect! And not only that, but something worse. For, upon the wings of the slow night wind, there drifted over to me the mournful thrumming of a guitar. As it has turned out, the caravanners have proved very little trouble to any, and to myself least of all. In a day or two they moved down to the riverside, choosing one of the wildest and leafiest corners of the old abandoned chalk quarry, and for a week past I have seen nothing of them but a wisp of blue smoke from afar. And, indeed, October in the country, if your design is to keep step and step with the month through all its bewildering changes, leaves you but scanty leisure for social traffic with your kind. Every day now there is something new to wonder at and ponder over. To-day the gossamer was flying. If you stood in one of the low-lying sheltered meadows and turned your back to the light, the air seemed full of those ashen grey flecks. some only the merest threads, others of the breadth of a finger and several inches long. I have always believed that the gossamer spiders sit in the hedgerows spinning these varied draperies and letting them go upon the breeze to little more use and purpose than when a child blows soap bubbles for the mere delight of watching them soar. At least, what end could possibly be served by them, other than the sufficient and obvious one of bringing a note of austere, chilly delicacy into the riotous colour of an October day? But idling along this morning, with literally thousands of these grey filaments tempering the rich gold of the sunshine far and near, I chanced to stretch forth a hand and capture one of them. Between my fingers there hung a shred of fabric, infinitely finer than anything that ever came from loom devised by man. And within it sat the gossamer spider herself, a shining black atom, evidently vastly surprised and alarmed at the sudden termination of her flight. After that I pulled down a score or so of these gossamer airships, and although a few were tenantless, the most of them bore a passenger embarked on who shall say how long and how hazardous a voyage. Yet, while none fell to earth as I watched, but seemed to have the power of rising ever higher and higher, it is certain that the gossamer spider's flight must end with each day's sun. The heavy autumn dews must sweep the air clear of them at first tinge of dusk. If there is anything in the old saying that a plentiful berry harvest foretells a hard winter, then have we bitter times in store. The hedges are loaded with scarlet wherever you go, and yet in all this flaunting brilliance there seems to be no two shades of red alike. The hollyberries approach more nearly than any to pure vermilion. Then come the hips, the roseberries with their tawny red, and the haws that are richer of hue than all others, perhaps, yet of a sombreness that quietens the eye for all its glow. Ruddy are the bryonies and the bittersweet. The rowans love to hold aloft their masses of pure flame, the rich rowan colour that is always seen against the sky. Along the edge of the hazel copse, where the butcher's broom grows, its curious oblong fruit gives another note of red. But they are all essentially different colours. Nature often duplicates herself in blues, yellows, and particularly in a certain shade of pale purple, of which the mallow is a common type. But among red flowers, red berries, finding one, you shall not find its exact counterpart in hue in all the countryside. In southern England, the general lurid effect due to change of leafage in the forest trees belongs of right to November, but already there are abundant signs of what is coming. Though the woods, on a distant view, still look gloriously green, a nearer prospect reveals a touch of autumn in almost every tree. In the beech woods nearly all the branches are tipped with brown. The elms have bright yellow patches oddly dispersed amidst foliage still of almost summer-like freshness. The willows by the river are full of golden pencillings. Only the oaks remain as yet uninfluenced by the changing times. The temperate autumn nights that have checked the sap flow of less hardy things have had no influence on the oak woods. They wait for the first real frosts, the knock-down blow. And strangely, though October is nearing its end, the frosts do not come. The nights are still, moist, dark, and full of the twanging note of door beetles, and now and again the steady whir of passing wings. This is the sound made by the hosts of migrant birds, all journeying southward, travelling in silence and by stealth of night. Coming out into the darkness, and hearing this mighty rushing note high overhead, you get a queer sense of underhand activity and concealed purpose in the world, as though scenery were being swiftly changed, a new piece hurriedly staged, under cover of the blinked lights. It tends towards a feeling that is rather foreign, not to say humbling, to your desires, that of being made a spectator rather than a participant in the great earth play. Or it may have another and a stranger effect. The sound of all that strenuous motion, the deep travel note high in the darkness, may come to you with all the urging inspiration of a summons. You may restrain only with difficulty and much assembling of prudence, the impulse to gird up and be off southward in the track of the flying host. The old nomadic instinct is not dead in humanity, as he well knows who keeps his feet to the green places of earth and his heart tiding with the sun. Now, too, the brown owl begins his hollow plaint in the woodlands. Comes to you through the fast falling dusk, the direction and intensity of the cry varying with astonishing swiftness as you stop to listen on your homeward way. This is conceivably the "doo-hoo" that Shakespeare heard. And there is another note, which seems to be an answer to it, and which sounds something like "Cawick," and might by a stretch be allowed to stand for the "to wit" in the song. But "to wit, to woo" in a single phrase, from a single throat, that seems to be a piece of owl language that has become obsolete with the centuries. There is a stretch of lane here, running between high grassy banks, densely overshadowed by trees, which is always dark on the clearest nights of any season, but of a Cimmerian blackness on these moonless evenings in late October. As if they knew their opportunity for service, the glowworms often light up the place from end to end, so that it is possible, steering by their tiny lamps alone, to keep out of the ditch that yawns invisibly on either hand. I came through the lane this evening and counted near upon a score of these vague blotches of greenish radiance hovering amidst the dew-soaked grass, each bright enough to show the time by a watch held near. As long as I can remember, glowworms have been plentiful in this stretch of dark overshadowed lane, and very scarce in all other quarters of the village. New colonies of glowworms seem difficult to establish, although single lights do appear in places where they have not been seen before, and in ensuing years appear again and again, generally in slowly increasing numbers. It is not wonderful that glowworms should keep to the same grassy bank season after season, because, as all countrymen know, it is only the lampless male that flies. The female, who bears the light, and on whom the persistence of the race depends, lives and dies probably within no more than the same few square yards of tangled herbage. What seems really wonderful is that single glowworms of the female sex should occur in places far removed from old resorts of their kind, seeing how feeble are their means and how slow their rate of travel. I have said that the flocks of birds that can sometimes be heard in the quiet of October nights, passing seaward over the village, are generally silent, save for the dull, pulsating roar of their wings. As I lifted the latch of the garden gate to-night, and stood a moment listening in the darkness, the old sound grew out of the silence of the hills, and there went swiftly by what seemed only a small flock. But now and again, as they passed, I could hear a note bandied to and fro in the company, a chuckling, voluble note, which I recognised instantly. They were fieldfares, the first comers of their species. From now onward, I knew, their queer outlandish cry would mingle with the common sounds of the fields, and not only theirs, but the notes of all other foreign birds that winter here, for the fieldfare is generally the last to come. This cry in the darkness above me, however, was strange in a double sense, because while the silent hosts were emigrants, only at the commencement of their long perilous journey, this chattering company had safely arrived at its bourne, all the hazards of the voyage happily past, and it seemed only in the way of nature for bird or man to set forth mute of voice upon a difficult and dangerous enterprise, while to win through safe and sound must provoke each alike to self-congratulation. My fieldfares were hallooing because they were out of the wood. End of section 20. Section 21 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, November, Part 1. No mirth, no cheerfulness, no healthful ease, no comfortable feel in any member, no warmth, no shine, no butterflies, no bees. November. It was the old vicar of Windlecombe who ironically quoted the lines as we went along our favourite path together, the path that runs between Arun River and the woods. The first frosts had come and gone, and left us in the midst of the usual revolutions and surprises. In a single day the ash trees had cast their whole weight of foliage to earth, green as in summer prime. Though as yet not a single leaf had fallen from the other forest trees, all had changed miraculously. The beechwoods looked like vast smouldering fires. Every elm stood up clothed to its finger-tips in shreds of gold leaf. Here and there in the wood a dash of vivid scarlet showed where a sycamore had been found and struck by the frost. Larch, willow, maple, birch, each added to the glowing prospect its individual shade of tawny brown, or drab, or yellow. We walked in a land where, for once, the sunshine seemed a superfluous thing. To turn the eye away for a little while from all that intolerable radiance, and rest it on the oak woods, where alone a vestige of summer greenery endured, or on the cool grey stems of the stripped ash trees, was a pleasure I found myself furtively snatching as we went along, although I left the sentiment discreetly unexpressed. The old vicar stopped, removed his great white Panama, and mopped his forehead luxuriously. No warmth, no shine, he repeated. Now, where in the world could the poor soul have lived who wrote that? And no bees. Why, I can hear them now, thousands of them. It was true enough, and with the bees were the November butterflies too, if he could only have seen them. In a sunny corner by the pathside stood an old pollard ash, its trunk rearing up out of the thicket high over our heads, like a huge double fist thrust into a green gauntlet of ivy. It was only one tree among innumerable others in the wood, and the same stirring scene was enacting round each of them. Though with everything else, the season was autumn, for the ivy it was the heyday of spring. The great tree above us was smothered in golden blossom, the nectar glistening in the sunshine, a rich honey scent burdening the still air. There were not only hive bees and butterflies rioting at this, the last outdoor feast of the year, but bumblebees, wasps, droneflies, every other creature that could fly and had escaped the chills of the November nights. The air was misty with the glint of their wings, and full of a deep sweet song. As we passed along by the wood, we were always either drawing into the zone of this ivy music, or leaving it behind us, and never once did it forsake our path all the morning through. We came at last to a spot where the woods fell back from the waterside, and a stretch of wild, hillocky grassland, overgrown with briar and bramble, bordered the stream. Between the willows that stood upon the bank, dipping their yellow autumn tresses in the flood, I could see the placid breadth of the river, with its topsy-turvy vision of the glowing hills beyond. Hills that, by reason of the interlacing boughs above, were directly invisible. A lark broke up almost from under our feet, and went slanting aloft into the blue sky, singing as though it were April. The Reverend put a hand upon my arm. "Well, what do you see?" he asked. "Everything must be changed since we were here last, and—" "I see," said I, rather disturbed, "a painter's easel straddled in front of your favourite creek, an easel with a three-legged stool before it, but no painter. I see also, a little farther on, a big white umbrella, with the top of a sombrero just showing above it, and a great cloud of tobacco smoke drifting out of it. But here again, no other sign of painter or man. Shall we go back?" But he was for pushing on. As we approached the umbrella, a throaty tenor voice was uplifted to a weird foreign strain. "En passant Pasquale Montholon, la dig dig dong, la dig dig dong, je rencontre un jeune tendron, la dig dig." Superb, superb! If only I could excite myself to if only that tumultuous thrill which I know always presages. La dig dig dong, j'offre tout de suite ma main, ye la brig d'Ontaine, ye. Or at least so the gibberish sounded. But now it suddenly left off. A pallet went rattling to the ground. The short squat figure of the owner of the caravan burst into view. "Gruse, I cannot do it. I really cannot. I am not sufficiently inspired today. I am not great enough. Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought it was my friend's step. Why, the water-bearer, to be sure. How do you do? It was my first glimpse of Spelthorne by light of day, and I own to myself frankly that the night had been kind to him. A fringe of yellow-grey hair escaped in all directions beyond the brim of his hat. He had a florid, puffy, indeterminate face, eyes at once selfish and sentimental, and a week-old beard still further ostracised a chin already too retiring. Like his companion, he wore a gold watch chain of heavy calibre, with a bunch of seals and trinkets upon it. But his clothes, that in the darkness had seemed much tattered and torn, now appeared entirely disreputable. They were, moreover, covered with finger marks of paint, to which he was now adding as he ceremoniously welcomed us. "Art, what is it?" he cried, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair, when presently, at his earnest invitation, the Reverend had sat himself down before the easel and was making a grave show of inspecting the canvas upon it. "And the artist, where is he?" He made a dramatic pause. "Where indeed?" quoth the Reverend, grimly staring before him. "You see this picture?" wagging a chrome yellow thumb over the canvas. "9/10 of it are the work of one exalted day. The rest the unilluminated toil of a week. Strange that we should be made so. At one moment, like Prometheus, stealing the very fire from heaven, and at the next, but only an artist can really comprehend." He filled his pipe with a resigned, quiet sadness. "Now Greuze, that is my friend who is travelling with me," he went on. "Greuze, poor fellow, he never realises the difficulties in his path, because, let me put it in the kindest way, because, well, the truth is, poor Greuze has mistaken his calling. No better fellow in the world, you know, a hard plodder, always trying, always doing his best. But, you see, that brings us back to what I said just now. Art and the artist, where will you find them? And what are they?" A slight cough sounded in our rear. Looking round, I saw that the long lean man had returned to his easel unmarked by any of us. The Reverend got abruptly to his feet. "Well," said he, "you have a great responsibility. Supreme gifts in a man mean that much will be required of him. So bend your back to it. Good day." As we passed by the other easel, its owner looked up pleasantly, but his brush kept busily to work. "Don't go yet," he entreated. "I am so glad to... But you won't mind, will you, if I go on with... You see, I have not had very long at it this morning. Spelthorne, he was getting so anxious about the stew that I had to run back to the caravan and... Or else he would have... It wouldn't have done, of course, to let him go himself. When once he has got into the mood, the slightest little thing..." He rambled on thus, scarcely ever finishing a sentence, and all the while dabbing away industriously at his sketch. He, too, I had never yet beheld in daylight, but, unlike his friend, Sunshine rather improved his appearance than otherwise. It could not fill up the gaps in his coat, nor had it a lustrating effect upon his linen, yet it revealed in his long cadaverous face, and in his mild sad eyes, a delicacy, a sensibility that I had not remarked in them before. As he talked, the old vicar studied his voice attentively. "Spelthorne," he went on in his curious, disjointed, breathless way. "Spelthorne, his work is so immeasurably, he has such a demand for it that, and I am always so glad, of course, to do any little thing to save him trouble. I really think no man in the world ever had a better friend." The Reverend was standing close behind him now. He laid a hand gently on Gruser's dilapidated shoulder. "Don't hurry," he said. "At least don't hurry with your mind. Above all, don't worry. It is all coming beautifully. When did you see your doctor last?" The question, unexpected as it was by myself, seemed to surprise Gruse infinitely more. The blood got up into two bright points in his cheeks. His brushes rattled against his palate. He looked round at the old vicar tremulously. "Doctor? Why, what makes you think Oh, I am very well indeed, never better." He stopped, looking up into the sightless, kindly blue eyes that appeared to be as steadily gazing down into his. There was a moment's silence, and then, if I ever saw real untrammelled joy spring into a human face, I saw it in his. "Do you really think so?" he cried. "You think well, sometimes lately I have thought myself that—" Spelthorne's voice grumbled out from behind the umbrella. "Now, my dear Gruse, have I not frequently told you that though I am willing to lend you anything I have, I always expect—" Gruse sprang to his feet. "It is his cadmium," he whispered, horrified. "I borrowed it, and never— how very annoying for him." "Now, there is a strange thing," said the Reverend musingly, as we trudged on our way together. "A man well on in a rapid decline, and neither knowing nor caring about it. As glad, indeed, to hear the thing confirmed as if someone had left him a legacy. A month, did you say? Then he may never go out of Windlecombe by the road." We made a long day's round, taking meadow, riverside, wood and downland in our walk, and reaching home again only when the lights were beginning to star in the misty combe. For we had a special object in our journey. To the townsman it may well seem as fruitless a task to seek wild flowers in November as to go gathering nuts in May. Well, here is a list of what we found in one November day's ramble about a single village in Highland Sussex. 57 distinct species, and of many we could have gathered, not single flowers, but whole handfuls, had we willed. Nor is the list an exhaustive one, either for the district or the time of year. Bringing more eyesight, leisure and diligence to the task, no doubt a fuller inventory could be made in any mild season. Dandelion, furze, red dead nettle, white dead nettle, marguerite, poppy, musk thistle, charlock, buttercup, red clover, white clover, pimpernel, calamint, blackberry, mayweed, field madder, sandwort, white campion, red campion, hawkweed, penny cress, hedge mustard, knapweed, mallow, harebell, daisy, hogweed, yarrow, sheepspit, marjoram, cudweed, groundsel, nipplewort, small bindweed, ragwort, silverweed, persicary, mouse-ear, strawberry, teasel, sunspurge, dwarf spurge, hedge parsley, rock rose, cranesbill, heather, betony, viper's bugloss, burnet saxifrage, sow thistle, wild pansy, shepherd's purse, herb robert, nonsuch, ivy, chickweed, veronica. There has come a spell of chilly, overcast weather, and the long dark evenings have settled upon us at a stroke. At twilight to-day, as I came into this silent floored, comfortable room and lit the candles on my work table, it seemed strange that I should do so, and yet the ordinary life and traffic of the village be still going on outside. Hitherto, so it appeared, the village quiet had fallen always before the need for candlelight. I had looked out before drawing the curtains close, and heard not a step stirring, seen the windows dark in the lower stories of the cottages, and here and there a pale light glimmering behind the drawn blinds of upper rooms, for your true Sussex villager hates to sleep in the dark. But to-night some new order of things seemed to have been suddenly ordained. Footsteps, hurried or leisurely, voices old and young, the rumble of wheels, even the distant chime of Tom Clemmer's hammer, all the sounds that go to make up the common rumour of workaday life in a village, were abroad in the air, though already the hills were lost in the gloaming. The white chrysanthemums by the garden gate were nothing but a dim blotch on the murky autumn night. I lit the candles, homemade candles of yellow beeswax, and set them on their little mats of plaited green leather. I got out a new quire of foolscap, sobering in its empty whiteness, its word-hungry look. I arranged the ruler, the old cut-glass ink-pot, the painted leaden frog that serves for paper-weight, the elephant that carries a pen-wiper as howdah, ash-tray and tobacco jar and sheaf of favourite pipes, all in their proper stations. I drew the old oak elbow chair sideways to the table, sideways because that was non-committal. Too squarely businesslike an approach in the outset, as I know of old time and cost, often scatters the fairies into the next county, and you may chew to shreds a whole quiverful of goosequills before they again come crowding and whispering curiously about your ears. But having made all these exact preparations, I chanced to turn to the open window for a final look down the street, and knew at once that I was lost. It was the steady far-off song from Tom Clemmer's anvil that overcame me more than anything, and the red glow amidst the elder bells that overhung the forge. But all else conspired in one basilisk-like lure to get me forth. The busy wending to and fro, and the cheery commerce of tongues in the darkness, footsteps and voices that I knew as well as I knew my own. Twinkling lights in cottages, the illumined windows of the little sweetstuff shop, the cobbler's den, the inn, the village store, the church lit up for evensong, and the bell quietly tolling, as it seemed, somewhere far up in the black void of the sky. Again, the smell of the night, that moist, earthy fragrance of decaying leaves and tang of frost and pungent scent of simmering firelogs from stacks new broached on these first chilly evenings in November. It all ranged itself together before me as something, ever present and constant in my life, that I too often disregarded, took for granted. The jumble of thatch and red-tiled roof and grey flint wall, sheep and lowing kine and cackling poultry, bevy of kindly human hearts, sharp tongues and willing hands, all wedged up together in one green crevice of the hills, and calling themselves collectively by the old South Saxon name of Windlecombe. End of section 21. Section 22 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, November, Part 2. I went first of all a few strides out over the green and looked backward, rightly to estimate, if I could, my own part in the little communal symphony. The bluff bulk of the house, with its coven roof and many gables, stood dark against the greyer darkness of the hills, and behind it rose sable elm plumes, fast thinning under the recent autumn chills. From its windows shone lights of varying significance. There were my own red-shaded candles with a corner of a crammed bookcase dimly visible above them. There were naked kitchen lights, with ware of polished pewter and copper glinting behind, and a pleasant clatter of crockery. There was a window where the light burnt red and low and wavering as from a spent hearth, and a quiet ripple of music from a piano keeping it congenial company. There was the window high up in the great gable, whose flickering light cast a bunch of head shadows on the ceiling, suggestive of nursery bedtime and fairy tales round the fire. It was all very reassuring and enheartening. Yes, the old white house had its integral part to play in this good English game of neighbourhood, and played it passing well. Round Tom Clemmer's forge a group of village lads was gathered, all looking on at the work with an interest that amounted well nigh to fascination. As I came up and stood unobserved in the shadow of the elder tree, there was before me a picture in which two colours only were represented, glowing crimson and deep velvety black. Young Tom stood, pincers in hand, watching the iron in the fire. Behind him his apprentice laboured at the bellows. With every wheezy puff the furnace roared out an imprecation, and spat hot cinders upon the floor. It was a large piece of metal that Tom had in work, something out of the ordinary run of his business, it seemed, and he turned it and shifted it with an anxious eye. No one spoke a word, for somehow we all knew that a crisis was coming, and we were expected to hold our tongues until it was victoriously past. At length the moment came. Tom thrust the pincers into the blaze, and drew the white-hot iron out upon the anvil. Immediately the apprentice left the bellows, seized a great hammer, and, swinging it over his head, began to let fall on the metal an unceasing rain of mighty blows. As Tom twisted and manoeuvred the glowing mass about with all the strength of his wiry arms, it lengthened, squared itself in the middle, flattened out at each end, bent into complicated curves, then turned upon itself and was united miraculously head to tail. Still gripping the writhing thing with one hand, Tom took a punch in the other and pointed it to various parts of the work. And wherever he pointed, the hammer drove a bolt hole clean and true through the rose-red iron. Finally, Tom lifted the finished piece above his head and came striding to the door with it. The crowd of onlookers scattered right and left. Out into the darkness he plunged, and straight to the pool by the roadside. We saw the thing poised for a moment like a mammoth firefly over the water, and then, with a roar and an angry splutter, it vanished into the pond. It was scarcely 6 o'clock, and already the night was pitch black, with a creeping, chilly air from the north. It was not loitering weather. People were moving briskly on their several ways. Cottage doors were shut and windows diamonded with moisture. Roving about with no settled purpose but to humour the neighbourly fancy and to identify myself with the evening life of the place, I presently came full tilt at a corner upon Farmer Cole's. "The very man," said he, barring the way jovially with his stout oak stick. "Didn't ye promise me that when I killed that 4-year-old wether ye'd come and take a bite along o' us? Well, 'tis a saddle to night, and I was on the road to fetch ye. Roundabout, man, and straight for the farm." Now, when a Southdown flockmaster, whose pedigree sheep are famous throughout the county, bids you to his table, with the announcement that the principal dish is to be mutton, there is only one thing to do, that is, if you are human and of sane mind. I turned and went along with him without demur. "Jane's sister and her man be with us," said Farmer Coles, as we left the village behind and mounted the steep lane that led to the farmhouse. "And Weevilly'll be there, and the gals be home, so we won't lack for company. I don't know as ye ever met Jane's sister's man, Parrot by name. No? Wonderful, well-edicated man though he be." We found the Reverend Mr. Weevilly, a shining gem of purest water, set in the ring of hearty country faces that surrounded the drawing-room fire. The broad-shouldered, broad-faced man, with a mat of sandy beard and a very bald head, who occupied the great armchair in the corner, I judged to be Mr. Parrot. Mrs. Coles and her sister, both comfortable of mien and rigidly ceremonious of visage, sat side by side in flowing black silk gowns, knitting as for a wager. The younger members of the household, who filled the interspaces of the circle, fidgeted in a constraint of merry silence, exchanging covert glances of boredom, and all obviously pricking ears for the first sound of the dinner gong. This clanged out behind us almost at the moment of our entry into the room, providentially cutting short the first amenities of greeting, and before my fingers had done aching from Mr. Parrot's grip, I found myself sitting at the loaded board, with Mrs. Parrot's voluminous drapery overflowing me on the one side, and, on the other, her husband's great brown barricade of an elbow securely fencing me in. "Mutton," observed Mr. Weevilly presently, by way of filling up a pause in the conversation due to our all watching with secret anxiety Farmer Coles's attack on the joint. Mutton, and on a Monday. You remember the little game of alliteration we played at the school treat, Mrs. Coles? Really, we could make an admirable sequence here. Mutton and Monday, and Miss Matilda sitting by my side, and if it were only March instead of... And we'll soon all be munchin' of it, sir, cried Farmer Coles. Ha ha ha! That's the best hem at all. Gravy, George? At the inclusion of her name in the sequence, the eldest Miss Coles had blushed, then let her glance demurely droop upon her chrysanthemum-wreathed bosom. It was a moment of exceeding pride and satisfaction to her, for here was Mr. Weaverley beside her, an incontestable, a beautiful fact, while Miss Sweet for once was half a mile away. Now she looked up coyly. I think, she hesitated, I could suggest oh, I know a lovely one. Mr. Weaverley laid down knife and fork to rub his hands delightedly. Do tell us, he murmured. I am positively longing to. The eldest Miss Coles turned him glamorous eyes. Marmaduke, she said. And I think I was the only one present to realise the whole ingenuity of the manoeuvre. For she had contrived here, in the open family circle, before a dozen people, yet with entire meekness and propriety, to address Mr. Weaverley by his Christian name. As the meal progressed and tongues became generally loosened, Mr. Parrot, whose silence, except as regarded his hearty application to his food, had so far remained unbroken, now essayed to contribute his share of the talk. His first effort was a startling one. Do, he began, smiling over his shoulder at me. Do you l. He stopped and gazed helplessly towards his wife. Like, dear? Suggested Mrs. Parrot softly. No, I was going to ask ye if you lend then? Emma, I don't want to borrow Northern of the gentleman. It was just to ask if he lived there, you are, in what say, Jane? 'Tis apple pie, George, or maybe you'd sooner try the pie, Jane. Pie, my dear, pie, if you please, mum, and a double dose of the sugar. They allers says, don't they, sir, as if a man has a sweetheart, dear? Oh, aye, laughed Mr. Parrot, suddenly inspired. He looked across the table roguishly at Mr. Weaverley and Matilda, and all glances followed his. Well, never mind. We was all young once, and... Mrs. Coles deftly drew the fire of attention away from the absorbed unconscious pair. William dear, Emma has nothing in her glass. And there you sit, staring at the cheese as if it were only for show, and as wooden as you are. And do pray pass the old ale to Mr. Oh, deplorably so, sighed Mr. Weaverley to the rapt Matilda. Over and over again I have remonstrated with her, but all in vain, I fear. Each time I have said, Mrs. Gates, if you will feed little children on new hot bread and red herrings and, only think of it, beer, you will find not only their physical, but's their moral nature entirely. It is strange how, in a room full of heterogeneous talk, the attention of a quiet listener flits uncontrollably from one quarter to another. Much as I was interested in Mrs. Gates's domestic policy, I lost it here to find myself in the rickyard, taking part, against my will, in some complicated sporting affray. And there were 3 of them, father in the trough, and I crept up and got the gun barrel through a hole in the side of the sty, and just as the old buckrat. And then it was Mr. Parrot again. Emma'd tell you better'n me, Jane. It came hoot-tootin' round the corner, and afore I could stop, George. Nonsense. Afore I could seize hold of the Emma, do bide quiet. Afore I could say Jack Robinson, the old mare, she backed upon her haunches, and she. And from Miss Matilda, "Oh, I should so love to, Mr. Weaverley. Is there a very beautiful view? And could we walk there and back in an afternoon, do you think?" And from Farmer Coles, folding up his napkin, "Well, if no one want hev no more." The rest was lost in the rustle of Mrs. Coles's skirts as she uprose. "And now, William dear, I think we ladies will leave you to your smoke, and when you are quite ready we will have a rubber and a little music." In the drawing room presently the farmer and his wife and Mr. and Mrs. Parrot sat down to a solemn, silent game of whist. A "happy family" party made a vortex of merriment in a far corner. At the piano stood Mr. Weaverley, translating into soft melodious trifles such songs as "The Wolf" and "Hearts of Oak." As for me, I was happy in the great chair with the family portrait album, full of early Victorian photographs, which I sincerely believe to be amongst the most fascinating and informing productions of all that fertile reign. But after an hour of this inspiring occupation, I was suddenly roused to the contemplation of a still greater wonder. One of the card players had spoken, and that sharply. "Emma, my dear." I strolled over and watched the play. Something had happened to disturb Mr. Parrot, for though his face was turned from me, I could see that his bald head had taken on a purple hue. And gradually, as the game progressed, the mystery became clear. "Emma, my dear, Emma." It was Mr. Parrot's voice again, and this time with a sharper ring of warning and remonstrance. 2 or 3 times in the next half hour he spoke thus, and each time now I was able to detect the cause. Mrs. Parrot was cheating. Continually her neck craned for a sidelong view of her opponent's cards. She revoked unblushingly. Once I could have sworn I saw a card corner sticking out of a fold in her silken lap. The aces she seemed to be trying to mark with her thumbnail. And all the time, though Mr. Parrot got momentarily redder and more wrathful, Farmer Coles and his wife sat serenely smiling, evidently well used to dear Emma and her little harmless, eccentric ways. Here is a winter's day already, and still November. As I looked forth at sunrise this morning, the whole village was white with frost. I could hear the ice in the wheel ruts crackling under the tread of passers-by. A single thrush piped forlornly somewhere in the dense thicket of the churchyard, and as I leaned out into the nipping blast, a word came up to me, bandied between a trudging labourer and his friend, a word that brought with it an entire new sheaf of thoughts and memories. "More 'n half like Christmas, bean't it, Bill?" It was said but in jest, and that unthinkingly. Yet by the calendar, as a glance now told me, Christmas was scarce a month away. While the sun was yet no more than a white spot in the faint gold mists of morning, I took the lane that led to the Downs. It was strange to see how the frost had missed all the bright-hued berries in the hedgerows, and how the ivy leaves were only rimmed with white. It was the same with the prickly holly foliage. The spines were thickly encrusted, while the dark green membranes of the leaves had given no finger-hold to the frost. But the colour of the grass and dead dry herbage by the wayside was completely blotted out. Every blade and twig stood up stark and white against its fellow, and here it was easy to see which way the frozen air had been drifting all night long, because on the windward side the pale accretion was thicker. In the more exposed places it more than doubled the natural girth of the stems. Where the dew pond lay, at the top of the hill, far above the swimming lowland mists, there must have been bright sunshine from the very first, for here the veneer of frost had melted into dewdrops that flashed back 1,000 prismatic rays amidst the emerald of the grass at every step. But behind each upstanding tussock the frost still held as white and thick as ever. The water, too, in the pond was still frozen over. As I came up to the rail, a flock of starlings rose whirring over my head. They had been waiting there on the sunny side of the bank for the ice to melt round the pond edges, and thither they would return to slake their morning thirst as soon as I passed on. Keen and unkindly blew the blast, so that one must keep ever moving to withstand the chill of it. Looking round me on the waste of hills, I could see that the northern slopes still retained their wintry hue, though all those facing to the sun were intensely green. Below in the valley only the oak woods kept their bronze stain of autumn. Every other tree, the hedges that divided ploughlands and meadows, the winding line of thicket marking the course of the river, all looked bare and dark in the glistening pallor of the sun. The river itself, between the broad water meadows, seemed like a river of ink. As I took in all the cheerless, void purity of what lay below me, thinking to myself that this indeed was winter, there came a sudden cawing and dawing high up in the frosty steel blue dome of the sky, and here again was confirmation of that unenlivening fact. A great company of rooks and jackdaws was streaming by, but with none of its summer zest and purpose. The throng made a general progress towards the south, yet it was obviously doing little more than killing time, spinning out the business of a doubtful journey into the semblance of a morning's task. Instead of going straight forward in one steady strong tide, the birds were incessantly veering back in wide circles, crossing and recrossing each other's paths aimlessly, and weaving a mazy dark pattern on the sky. I watched this dubious host from the hilltop until it vanished in the eye of the sun, and then, fairly beaten at last by the razor-edged north wind, turned and went back to the village. It was winter again, in truth, and there was little sense or profit in blinking it. I would strike my flag now, as I had struck it often before. And the flag with me was the little staging of fernery that still concealed the yawning blackness of my study hearth. I pulled it all down and stowed it away, and by, when the ash logs were sizzling and glowing, and the sparks were volleying up the flue, and a living warmth pervading the room, I plucked up new heart and courage. No mirth, no cheerfulness, no healthful ease, no comfortable feel in any member, no warmth, no shine. It was all as false now as it must ever have been. And as for butterflies and bees, what but a sick fancy could crave for such delicacies out of season? End of section 22. Section 23 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. December, Part 1. We sat on the churchyard wall, the Reverend and I, debating many things. It was one of those silent, gloomy afternoons that would be cold but for their exceeding stillness. A heavy grey pall of sky lowered overhead. A multitude of noisy sparrows was going to bed in the thicket of ilex and yew, denoting that the time was nearing sunset, although not a tinge of sunset colour showed in the shrouded west. The same impulse, it seemed, had brought us both out of doors, which, elementally, was nothing more than a sudden realisation of the impossibility of remaining within. In the whole year's round, perhaps, there come only 2 or 3 days like this. You become the prey of a conviction that something cataclysmic is going to happen. There is a sense of the world slowing down in its age-long, giddy race through the pathless ether, a feeling that its momentum is almost spent, and that any instant it may come to a final stop, to be followed by the last trump and dissolution of all things. The mute house seems alive about you, and full of a sort of terror and foreboding. You are seized with an apprehension that the ceilings and roof are falling in, and hurrying forth, a like doubt comes upon you as to the stability of the sky. It looks so overburdened and unsafe. In this easeless, impotent frame of mind, I came up into the churchyard as being the most reassuring place I could think of, and found the Reverend wandering there for a like reason, and in much the same mood. "Wind and dirty weather coming," said he. "The sort of times to make people think of home and fireside, the need for human peace on earth and goodwill towards men. The very weather for me." As we sat on the wall, silent awhile, the bells in far-off Stavisham began their chime, every note drifting over to us sharp and clear through the miles of torpid air. "Winter coming," he went on, "the winter we all need once a year to knit us closer together. Listen to St. Barnabas practising his Christmas carolins, forging his link in the chain of bell ringing that in a week or two will stretch all round the world. It is my time coming, my own time. For did you ever think how little eyesight matters at Christmas? Blindness is nothing to a man then. Christmas is all glad sound, warm heartbeats, faithful words. And, please God, when the day dawns, there shall not be a cottage nest in Windlecombe that does not overflow with these. To see him so deeply moved, and hear him run on presently about his many schemes of comfort and relief, the furtherance of joy and merriment, goodwill and good cheer, to be sown broadcast throughout his little domain, was yourself to take the infection irresistibly. Whatever Christmas has become in the great outer world, in Windlecombe he held us year by year to all the old ideals and traditions. As I hearkened to him, the black sky, the sullen miasmic air, lost their significance. I found myself thinking only of the golden light and undimmed azure that must eternally lie beyond and above it all. And now, though I might have heard it long ago, if I had had but the heart to look up and listen, there, high against the drab heaven, a lark soared and sang. The dirty weather has come indeed. For many days I have not seen the tops of the hills. They have been hidden in the rain clouds that have been dragging ceaselessly over the coombe. The rain has not seemed to fall, but to flow horizontally from west to east, a gliding white curtain of water drops, hiding all but the nearest houses from the view. And yet, for all the deluge and the sobbing wind, the gloom, the cold, the miry ways, I would not change this solitary, inaccessible spot in England for the best of foreign sunshine, ease, and gaiety to be found by the tideless sea. Perhaps, if winter is to be given a place at all in the calendar, it must come in these few weeks leading on to Christmas. It is true that, so far as the natural outdoor world is concerned, there is no winter in the human conception of a season of decay and death. In an hour, when the sky lightened a little and the rain ceased its rattle on the window, I went out and found next year's corn greening the hillside, and in all the bare dark woodland there was not a twig without its new buds ripe and ready for another spring. The year's miracle play was beginning all over again before its last lines were said. Yet because, as the old vicar maintains, winter is a human necessity by reason of its heart-welding, neighbour-making qualities, winter we must all have. And so at this time I am glad to hoodwink myself into the belief that the rough-voiced, harrying weather is the very negation of life, bringing us all together for mutual comfort, like children in the dark. The rain is over now, seemingly for good. Last night at sundown the wind fell, and the grey cloud canopy lifted off to the northward, like the opening of a box. As the dense cloud pack broke away from the western horizon, the sun burst through and poured a sudden stream of red gold light up the coombe. Before this light had paled, the whole sky was crystal clear, and in the east, just above the earth line, shone the moon, a perfect human face, full jowled, low foreheaded, gazing down upon us all with a puzzled, quizzical smile upon her comfortable chops. I came up the street apostrophising her, and ran into a basket, and behind the basket was Greuze. He laid a bunch of lean bony fingers in my hand. "This is life again," he said feelingly. "To be weather-bound in a caravan, you know. Well, it is a little trying even for common people, but for a genius. Spelthorne, you see, cannot bear any constraint. At home he has a studio as big as a church, and when it rains he walks up and down it. But when he tries that in a caravan, really I have been very sorry for him, though of course I kept outside as much as I could." I had turned and strolled back with him under the pale December twilight. The new quiet of things, the frosty glimmer of the moon, here and there a star beginning to show, the renovated life of the village about us, all made for peace and content. Greuze suddenly stopped and laid his basket down. "Spelthorne wants to move on now," he told me. "He says we have painted the place out, and I haven't tried to persuade him, you know, but I don't want to go, and that's a fact." He looked at me distressfully, his stubbly lantern jaw in his lean hand. "What has happened to change the place so?" he asked. "Everybody you meet looks as if bound for a wedding. You are all humming carol tunes wherever you go. I haven't seen a dirty-faced child for a week. And how the people joke and laugh with each other. It can't be all because Christmas?" "Yes, it is," said I. "It is all because one old man we love insists on having it so, year by year. He has been into every home in the village, great and small, and fired each man, woman and child with his own rejoicing spirit. If you stop for the next 10 days, you will see things change more thoroughly still. Wait till you see them bringing the Christmas tree up the hill for the children's treat. And the committee going round on Boxing Day to award the prizes for the home decorations. And if you have never heard real old-fashioned carols, nor listened to a real Christmas sermon preached by a holy angel in a white beard." He took up his basket hurriedly. If I must go," he said, as we trudged on towards the quarry where the caravan had made its pitch, "I shall think of you all wherever I... It seems rather selfish to press him, don't you think? But perhaps... Oh, here we are. Do come in and talk to Spelthorne for a bit, will you? He sees so little company, and... Is that you at last, Greuze? My good fellow, what an unconscionable time to take in procuring no more than 1 pennyworth of pepper, and just a pound of gravy beef. To say that I am excessively annoyed is wholly to understate my... Of course, all my carefully thought out plans for the meal are entirely upset." I drew back into the darkness. "No, not to-night. There are times when you cannot stand, I mean when a call is not convenient, and... Why on earth don't you tell the selfish old brute to go to smithereens?" This has been a week of undeniably hard work for us all, and one at least, is by no means sorry that tomorrow is Christmas Eve. Most of the time I seem to have spent on the top of a rickety step-ladder in the schoolroom, having tin tacks and boughs of holly and gaily coloured flags passed up to me by Mr. Weaverley and the mutually distrustful Miss Sweet and Miss Matilda Coles. Tom Clemmer, helped by half a dozen others, brought the great tree up from Windle Woods, and it stands now in its tub of spangled cotton wool, a gorgeous sight, every branch weighed down with toy shop treasures, the queen doll at its apex brandishing her gilt-starred sceptre high up among the oaken beams of the ceiling. Every available chair or bench in the village has been confiscated and ranged round the room. The tables at the far end fairly creak and groan under their burden of infantile good cheer. It is all ready for tomorrow. We put in the finishing touches with the last gleam of daylight this evening, Weaverley and I alone together. Then he locked the door, speechlessly tired and happy, and faded away, a black but benevolent ghost in goloshes, down the length of the darkening street. As for me, I followed at a respectful distance, with no object definitely in view, but to smoke a quiet pipe after the day's work, and enjoy the unwonted life and bustle of the village. Thinking it over discriminately, it seemed to be a great thing, a real advance on the true line of social progress, to be strolling about there, taking unfeigned pleasure in the sight of two small shops doubtfully illuminated with oil lamps and candles, and in the sound made by perhaps 50 people all told, as they clattered and chattered to and fro in a single narrow village street. There were folk, I knew, wandering just as aimlessly in the crowded thoroughfares of great cities miles away, whose ears were deafened with a prodigious uproar, and eyes blinded by a myriad superfluous lights, but who were not half so entertained, so thoroughly instilled with the sense of being one in a hustling, happy Christmas multitude as I. Then again, of all the thousands that the city promenader meets in the crush of a London street between one electric standard and the next, how many can he rightfully greet as neighbour, or even remember to have seen before? While here was I, after a good half-hour's loitering up and down, who had encountered none but the old familiar faces, nor let one go by without the kind word or friendly glance exchanged. Truly the scale, the mere arithmetic of life, goes for nothing. It is the proportional, the relative, that counts. There was not so much folly as we imagine in the grave debate of the old philosophers as to how many angels could stand upon a pin's point. I tarried a while in the broad beam of light that fell from the window of the village store, and, in the company of a dozen other loiterers, feasted eyes on its Yuletide splendour. From where I stood on the opposite side of the way, it seemed no less than a palace of glittering beauty. Candles of all colours in little tinselled sconces shone amidst the wares of every day, bacon and worsted stockings, loaves of bread and tin saucepans, butter, neckties, bars of mottled soap, and trousers in moleskin or corduroy. The ceiling of the shop, which at ordinary times is hidden by hanging festoons of boots, basketware, hedging gloves, coils of rope, was intersected now by chains of coloured paper and threadled holly leaves. There was a suspended roasting jack in a corner, slowly twirling round a grand set piece of Christmas knick-knacks, and there were two copper coal scuttles, the one filled with oranges, the other heaped high with bunches of green grapes that made the mouth water a dozen yards away. All these I gazed upon, and at the jostling throng of housewives, at least half a score within, and at the red-faced, perspiring shopkeeper, overdone with business. And from the bottom of my heart I rejoiced that they sufficed for me, that I should go to bed that night with as complete a sense of having looked on at the great world's Yuletide gladness as if I had tired out feet and eyes and nerves in the roaring maelstrom at the Elephant or the Messina Strait of the Strand. For indeed life and its disciplines, its experiences, its outcomes, can be no mere matters of dimension. When we come at last to find eternity and the angels, they are as like to be on a pin's point as outthronging all the labyrinth of the Milky Way. End of section 23. Section 24 of Neighbourhood, A Year's Life in and About an English Village by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. December, Part 2. From the village store I moved on presently to the little sweetstuff shop, and stood a while looking in through the holly garlanded door. Susan sat in a wilderness of scalloped silver paper, presiding over a lucky tub. There was no getting near her to-night for the mob of children that surrounded her, and overflowed into the street. But she bawled me an affectionate Christmas greeting, and passed me, by half a dozen intervening hands, in exchange for a thrown halfpenny, a packet from the Lucky Dip, which proved to contain a cherubim modelled out of pink scented soap. With this symbolic testimony to our old-time friendship bulging my pocket, I went rambling on again, and in course of time arrived at the Three Thatchers Inn. A tilt cart was just driving away from the door. A numerous company was gathered outside, speeding the vehicle on its way with laugh and jest. "Ye've not fared so bad," roared old Daniel Dray as he spied me in the darkness, "though ye didn't come to the drawin'. Ye've got a topside and a hand o' pig meat. Stallard here, he's got one o' the turkeys, and young George Hartlett the t'other. A good club it ha' been considerin'. And now the lot of us ha' got to bide here till Dan'l gets home from Stavisham with the tack." This annual prize drawing and division of the Christmas Club funds, with the subsequent wait in the cosy inn parlour while the things were fetched from the town, was a great event in Windlecombe. On this one night in the year we cultivated as a fine art the pleasure of anticipation, and each did his best to make the time go with mirth and neighbourly goodwill. The occasion was also, in some degree, a kind of benefit for the landlord, to which all might contribute as a duty, if by any chance the inclination lacked. Looking round the crowded room, I could think of hardly one of the well-known faces that was missing. The old ferryman was there. How he got there was a mystery, but there he was, in the corner of the settle whence he had been absent so long. Even George Artlett had stayed to await the arrival of his turkey, and now sat at my side quaffing lemonade, his face as grave and thoughtful as ever, but his eyes twinkling with a jollity I had never seen in them before. Young Daniel knew that no one would desire to curtail this part of the prize drawing ceremony, and there was little fear of his wheels being heard in the sloppy street for a good 2 hours to come. We stretched out our legs to the cheery blaze, and felt that for once we had succeeded in wing-clipping old Father Time. "Beef Club drawing again, Dan'l?" "Aye, Beef Club drawing again, Tom." In a break in the general clamour, the two veterans exchanged the thought slowly and pensively, looking down their long pipe stems into the fire. "And no one gone, Dan'l?" "Ne'er a one, Tom, thank God." "How Quirker do hold hisself, to be sure," said old Tom Clemmer after a pause, and none doubted who he meant. "Ah, and how do brisk along still? Another year o' him by, 'tis another blessin'. Here's to 'un wi' all our love and duty." It was a silent toast, but drunk deep. George Artlett's glass was lighter than any when he set it down. "But 'tain't been allus so," old Clemmer went on ruminatively. "How many drawin's ha' ye seen, Dan'l, boy and man? 30 belike, and I bean't fur ahint ye. And many's the time as some 'un's money ha' laid on the table wi' only widder or poor box to claim it. And he, poor soul, quiet in the littin' yard up there. Ay, 'tis a lucky drawin' with nane but livin' hands to draw." Daniel Dray took up the prize list and scanned it curiously, his white head thrown back, his spectacles straddling the extreme tip of his nose. "And what," said he, "will a single man unmarried do wi' a whole girt turkey bird, and him with never a wife? 'Tis wicked waste, neighbours. Him and the parrot, they'll ha' nought but turkey meat in the house from now to lady time." Storward's beady black eyes disappeared in a wide smile. "I knowed a man once," he said, "out in Utah State in 'Meriky. 'Twas got a brace of ostriches at Christmas drawin', and when it come to carvin' at dinner time, the poor feller he got no more 'an half a bite for hisself, because " He stopped, suddenly recollecting George Artlett's lustrating presence. "Ah, he wor married, I tell ye, and never a word of a lie. What'll I do with it, Dan'l?" The old ferryman leant from his corner eagerly, staring at the wall as though he saw there the picture that rose in his mind. "What'll I do wi' it? Jest think on't. Nob it hisself in a quiet kitchen o' Christmas mornin', his boots on and nane a ratin' for spannellin' about. Click clack from the roastin' jack, and tick tack from the clock, and a good cuss now and again from the old parrot, but never a word o' women's wrath. Ah, life, 'tis all jest a girt beef club drawin'. Some honest draws peace and quiet and turkey birds, and some draws " His lips closed on his pipe stem with a snap. A commiserate shake of the head went round the company. "And here," went on old Daniel, still conning the prize list, "here be Jack Farley wi' bare money and 4 ounces o' tobacco, him as don't smoke, and has 16 in family. Lor, Jack, how that there deuce do follow ye in life." Jack Farley sat in the draughtiest seat by the door, his invariable modest choice of station. No one had ever seen him without a smile on his emaciated, sun-blackened face, and now he was smiling more determinedly than ever. "I dunno, Dan'l," he expostulated gently. "'Twere a real double six when her an' me come together all they years ago. An' the chillen, they be good throws every one. An' that there new little 'un, Dan'l, nothin' of the deuce ace about him, I tell ye. But them as puts to sea, Dan'l, they must look for rough weather time and again." He squared himself and gazed about him as though his weekly carter wage of 14 shillings were as many pounds. Then he beat his mug upon the table jovially. "And now," said he, "I'll sing ye the mistletoe bell." It was the beginning of the real entertainment of the evening. Vocal music in the Three Thatchers at ordinary times was accounted a rather disreputable thing, a mere tap-room vulgarism by the habitual parlour company. But on certain rare nights in the year, of which this was one, every man present was expected to sing. One by one now, in Jack Farley's wake, followed the rest of the assembly, and every song had a chorus that shook the very roof beams of the house. No man thought of looking at the clock until, in the midst of a doleful melody from the landlord, old Tom Clemmer suddenly sprang to his one available foot. "'Tis the cart!" he cried, and made for the door. In the general stampede after him, I heard Captain Stallwood's grumbling voice. "That bean't right nohow for people as can't use tobacco to drawin' away from them as can. I means to head that there 4 ounces, Dan'l, and Jack Farley, the old swab, must make out as best 'a can with the turkey bird." "Yes, I can see it," said the Reverend, "plainer than the sun in a midday sky." With a taper at the end of a long cane, I had just ignited the last of the candles, and the great Christmas tree stood up before us, clad from its bole to its highest twig in a shimmering garment of light. We two were alone in the schoolroom, but beyond the closed door, we knew, was Mr. Weaverley, and beyond him again a sea of expectant faces filling the wide porch and stretching out half across the street under the still, frost-bound night. Every child that was not whispering excitedly to its neighbour was crooning to itself with irrepressible joy, and the sound came to us through the solid timber like the sound of a beehive just going to swarm. "Now open the door," said the Reverend, getting into his corner, "and if you miss a single thing, I'll haunt you when I am gone, to the end of your miserable life." I turned the key in the lock and retreated hastily. The door flung open. I saw the black form of Mr. Weaverley flicker aside, and expected the whole room to be invaded in a minute by an avalanche of scrambling, vociferating mites. But it did not happen so. "Not one has come in yet," said I, over the Reverend's shoulder. "They are just peering in at the door. I can see 30 faces, perhaps, with 30 mouths and twice as many eyes opened wide, but never a smile among the lot. How quiet they keep! But now trembling fingers are coming round the doorposts, and a boot or two has got beyond the threshold. The reluctant vanguard is being pressed forward by those behind. They are creeping in now at last. The crowd has divided, and they are edging up the room, right and left, keeping their shoulders against the walls. And all the time, every wide open eye remains fixed upon the tree in awestruck delight. You hear that low whispering note? They are beginning to find their voices again, and the girls are at last venturing to let go one another's hands. They are all in now, I think. At least the room could hardly hold another. And just as a failing mill dam begins to ooze, then to trickle and spurt, and finally in a moment gives way before the pressing tide, so the silence now broke down under the flood of child voices. Shouts and hurrahs, shrill peals of laughter, a hubbub of delighted commentary, made the rafters vibrate above us, and the window glass tremble in its quarries. Before the din had so far moderated that I could get my tongue to work again in the old vicar's service, Weevilly and his satellites were forging ahead with the first joyful business of the night. It all comes back to me now, as I sit alone and late by my workroom fire, clearer perhaps than when I was in the vortex of it all, with the happy voices ringing about me, and the toy drums and trumpets, the mouth organs and the whistle pipes, each going to swell the already deafening chorus the moment it was cut from the tree and put into some eager, uplifted hand. I can see the great glittering pyramid of the tree slowly giving up its treasures, until it bears nothing but the queen doll waving her star-tipped wand up among the flags and paper chains and holly garlands of the ceiling. I see Weevilly, poised on the top of the rickety ladder, gingerly dislodging her from her perch, while two overdressed and over-perfumed ladies hold the ladder firm below, and gaze up at him with fond and anxious eyes. Now at last I see the Christmas tree deserted, forgotten, while the tables at the end of the room are unloading themselves of their cakes and oranges and the score of other items appertaining to the feast. This is a silent time, save for the exploding crackers and occasional shrieks of fearsome delight. But it is over at last. The games begin, and with them reawakens all the old turmoil in redoubled fury. Though each of us has eaten more than is credible in any but a Downland bred child, this in no way impairs our agility. We hunt the slipper, we sing ourselves hoarse with green gravel, we play blind man's buff, and the Reverend, being caught, is allowed to go through the part of blind man at his own jovial suggestion, without the handkerchief over his eyes. And now two things come back to me more significant than all. But for this busy quarter of an hour, when he is staggering to and fro, clutching at pinafores and shock heads of hair, the Reverend has been rather a silent and deliberate figure in the midst of all the madcap business, more detached and quiet than I have known him at other Christmas gaieties bygone. He has hovered about on the fringe of the merrymaking, happy-faced as ever, yet with a certain slowness, a languor that I have never marked in him before. This is the one thing. The other is a random glance I take over my shoulder at the Christmas tree, when the fun and frolic are at their highest. Pathetically forlorn and deserted it looks, with bits of string clinging here and there to its drooping green fronds. A single shining trinket hanging forgotten on one of its lower branches, and half its glory already quenched. As I look at it, every moment sees another candle gutter out and die. A few minutes more, I think, and it will be nothing but a sombre and solemn fir tree again, ready to be carted down and set once more amidst the silent glooms of the wood. Somehow, in spite of myself, the two things, the two thoughts, blend themselves indivisibly together. I am glad now that, while through the long evening I poured into the Reverend's patient ear much idle chatter and many feather-brained conceits, I said no word to him about the dying Christmas tree. While I have been sitting here, turning over these thoughts, my own candles have burned low, the wood fire has sunk to a few waning embers. It must be growing late. How late I do not guess until I turn to look at the clock. Almost midnight. Another minute or two, and then Christmas morning. Perhaps, as the night is so clear and still, I shall be able to hear the hour chime in far off Stavisham. I go to the window, throw back the casement against the rustling ivy, and look forth. There is the glimmer of a lantern over by the Seven Sisters on the green, and a sound of people talking quietly together. I think I can distinguish George Artlett's deep tones, and his brother Tom's, the singing ploughman's, higher, clearer speech, and an admonitory word or two that might be Weeverley's. The clock is striking now. Before its last droning note dies on the frosty air, the darkness beneath me fills with a living, joyous music.
Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful, O ye nations, rise, join the triumph of the skies. With the angelic host proclaim, Christ is born in Bethlehem. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King.
End of section 24. End of Neighbourhood. A year's life in and about an English village by Tickner Edwardes.